Hi, I'm Edwin. Now, how many of you love paying for gas at the pump, which is like $4 or so? Now, back then when George Bush was still in his term, he predicted that by 2020 we would have hydrogen cars as the future of our transportation. However, what I'm trying to say is that as an alternative fuel, electricity is a much more efficient and viable method than using hydrogen to fill your car. Now, the first part is that electricity can be generated in many different ways. You can use a mix of fossil fuels or renewable energy. Like, for example, right now, electricity is generated via coal and sometimes via nuclear power. Now, if you want to switch to more renewable sources of energy, you could switch to wind or possibly solar. And depending on the area, you could use geothermal or perhaps water, hydropower, using ocean waves or via dams. Now, one of the most talked about ways that you can make hydrogen is through electrolysis, which is making hydrogen from water. Now, one of the biggest problems with making hydrogen from water is that it uses up too much energy and that most of it is spent in heat. Now, as a result, electricity is much more viable in terms of production. My second point is that electricity, unlike hydrogen, you can carry it. You already have an existing infrastructure, so transporting it wouldn't be as dangerous or as expensive. And electricity, you can send it to consumers like you already do through wires, and the infrastructure already exists. You might need to make some minor modifications. However, you would not need to implement anything brand new. And the other problem with transporting hydrogen would be that transporting hydrogen through a tanker or a train, for example, if that train derails or that tanker overturns, let's say on a freeway, you could cause some potential problems. Now, one of those problems is that hydrogen is invisible and there is no odor. So as a result of that, it's much harder to detect any potential hazards or explosions. The other problem with transporting hydrogen would be that if you don't go through tankers or trains, you can transport it through pipelines. Now, one of the biggest problems with transporting hydrogen through pipelines is that hydrogen causes metals to become a lot more brittle. As a result, you need something better, like stainless steel, which would drive up the cost exponentially. And one other part is that electricity is much more widespread. It's already available in this classroom, in your garage, and the infrastructure already exists. For example, there are a few hydrogen stations located here in California. There's some located in the East Coast. However, the biggest problem with that is that there are no currently available consumer hydrogen cars. With electricity, there are quick charge stations that can charge a car to around 80% in about 30 minutes. Or, as some of you may have heard, the Tesla Model S, you can swap out batteries in about under 5 minutes. So in order to implement these new technologies, it wouldn't take that much. Now, one of the oppositions against electricity would be people living in apartments who don't have a form of electricity. Now, what can be done is that you can just add electric ports next to the streets in order to charge these apartments. And finally, implementing hydrogen is much too expensive. You would need an entirely new infrastructure, and you would need to make new infrastructures along the way. You would need to somehow transport it. And the biggest problem as far as probably the fuel cells, which are currently really expensive and it's out of reach for the common consumer. The problem with hydrogen is that if you leave it overnight, it could evaporate. And as I talked about before, the metal is becoming brittle. It could potentially cause issues in your car. And in conclusion, while hydrogen is potentially viable, it isn't entirely effective right now when we need to free our independence from foreign energy sources. And if you want to make the switch now, we should use something that's available like electricity. Thank you for listening.
All right, well, you identify the topic. The phrasing at the beginning I thought was a little bit awkward. We do get a claim, but it's kind of a roundabout presentation of the claim. I think you want to be a lot more direct. The supporting claims are not really set up in advance of the argument. They come up as you were going through the speech. And one of the problems that I saw from the very beginning is it just seems like there's sort of a random way in which you're addressing those points. The first thing that you sound like you're doing is you're offering a rebuttal argument about against any problems about electricity before we've even heard what the benefits of electricity are in comparison to hydrogen systems. And so I think that sets up kind of a negative ethos that you're on the defensive instead of building a positive argument at the beginning. That should probably be something that comes toward the end. As you go through the speech, you do label your points, but like I said, it's not always clear as you're making the transition how the points are connected to each other, and the phrasing is often a little bit awkward. It sounds more like a stream of consciousness rather than a deliberate plan about how to advance the argument. There are a lot of minor claims and assumptions here, which I don't doubt are probably true, but I think that somebody who's unschooled in this is going to need some proof on to be convinced. So you talk about the brittleness that it is suggested, the need for stainless steel, the cost issues, the colorless, odorless nature, the potential dangers of hydrogen. But we don't get any examples. I don't have any authorities testing about any of this. There's no statistical issue. You mentioned at one point how there's a lot of waste, but if hydrogen is relatively plentiful, then it doesn't matter how much we waste. Why is that a problem? You don't really address that particular issue. So you need to signpost the structure a little more clearly and deliberately, like this is the direction I'm going on the argument instead of you're wandering through the argument, and your evidence needs to be developed a lot more. I think you're just presenting conclusions about hydrogen energy and electrical energy without proving it. You mentioned the charging stations, for instance, and you can charge, get an 80% charge within half an hour, and I'm going, okay, and we don't need an infrastructure for that. How many charging stations are available in the parking structure over here? How many thousands of cars are parked there every day? I guess the closest you come to addressing that kind of issue is when you're talking about that hypothetical about people living in apartment buildings and maybe they don't have a parking space. Well, then we'll put them on the street. I'm thinking about how tough it is to get a parking spot downtown sometimes, even with a meter, and now you want to put it with a charging station there, and that's going to be necessary in order for me to operate my car. All of a sudden I'm thinking, okay, I'd rather be driving the Hindenburg. What the hell is the problem with the hydrogen energy in this particular situation? So I think you need to have a more reasonable discussion of both the infrastructure for the electrical system and for the hydrogen, and I didn't think that I got a very good comparison on those two. All right, thank you.